One of the disciples looks up as they walk out of the temple and marvels at the gigantic stones that have been put there to build that temple. And I get that. I've had the opportunity to visit Notre Dame and Westminster Abbey, these long ago built large church places. And they're made with gigantic stones before the kind of mechanical frames that we use today exist. I don't know if any of you have visited the pyramids. But I can imagine looking at how big those stones are and thinking about the ancient people that put them there, that it would be a wonder. And so as the disciple stands there and looks, they wonder at the stones that have been put in place. But I don't think that it's just the physical part of getting those stones in place that this disciple is wondering at. You see, the temple had been built, and then it had been torn down by the Babylonians, and then the people were carried off into exile. When they came back, they rebuilt the temple. Now that was long before this disciple is standing there looking at it, but I think the disciple is probably thinking in part at being at the temple is kind of hey, our people built this. Long ago they built it, and then they rebuilt it, and this is part of our story, and this is a center of our faith and of our community. And look at how this is a representation of how we as a people have persevered and the relationship that we have with God. I get that one too. Our older son had to do a project for school this year, a genealogy project, and as we were getting together the family tree materials that we had, I flipped through some of it, and I did not realize how many generations of my family on my dad's side is buried in the same Lutheran church cemetery in a small town in Minnesota. Both my parents are there, my dad's parents are there, my grandma's parents and their parents are there, and I think my grandpa's parents and his parents are there, all in that one place. Now that church has been there for a very long time. The congregation even longer, and I had nothing to do with building it. I've only been to worship there maybe a dozen times, but yet, when I'm there, it feels like I'm amongst some accomplishment of my people, right? This is where my people come from and where they go to rest, and there's some connection that I have with that physical place because of that. So as this disciple stands there and says, wow, look at how big those stones are, I think it's a much bigger statement than just about rock that has been chiseled to put up on a building. Now, we don't just reserve that kind of attitude for religious spaces. Our back group there from Chicago, Wrigley Field is pretty important in that city, right? And no one that's living today helped build that, but you couldn't tear it down now because people would get upset because this is part of who that community is around that neighborhood, right, in that city. And it's not just even sports teams. We have all kinds of things that we build, not just buildings. We build monuments and statues and stuff for sure, but we also build institutions, and we build families, and we build marriages, and we build nations. And so in our country we have democracy. Were any of us there when the Declaration of Independence was written? No. And we didn't help write the Constitution, and we didn't send anybody to the convention that approved all of that, and yet we are the caretakers of it, and we are the ones that live with it, and we take pride in that, right? We understand that we have this freedom and the rights that go with it and the responsibilities. And we look to that as this thing that is our people's thing. Even if we didn't build it, it is still something that we look to. So there's all kinds of stuff that we build. But as Jesus is standing there and the disciple is saying that, when they get a little bit further away, they look at Jesus because he makes this comment, right? All these stones are going to come down. Now, for a long time I've thought that Jesus is like a future teller. He knows everything. He's just telling them what he already knows. But it could just be that Jesus knows people. And if Jesus knows people, he knows that, yes, we build a lot of things, but we also destroy a lot of things along the way. Often we destroy things so we can build things. Archaeology is a thing because generation after generation just tears stuff down and puts new stuff on top of it that suits us better. If you think about communities that have historic buildings, we have to make laws to protect the historic buildings because someone is going to look at it and go, boy, if I tear that down, I can build condos, or I can build a hotel, and then we could make some real money out of that little patch of land. And so we end up in these cycles where we build and destroy, and we build and destroy. And again, it's not just buildings that we destroy. We also have a way of destroying our own relationships. We have a way of destroying and fighting nation against nation, which is part of what Jesus talks about. And all of that often is in the name of progress. And so we live in this tension between what was and what is, and the progress being the thing that drives us to build, even if it means we're going to tear stuff down along the way. So Jesus tells them, not one stone will be left on stone. This is all going to come down. But then he goes on and says there'll be wars and rumors of wars. There will be nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and these sound like pretty scary words. So in our modern day time, when we hear these words, do they sound pretty relevant? They do. And I would bet if you could just take a journey back through the generations, in every generation people said, it's happening, right? So for us, when we hear these words, yes, buildings get torn down, but I think in our present day setting, the thing that I've wondered a lot about is the superpower. If you read through the Bible, the superpower changes all the time. Is the Egyptian Empire still in charge? No. What about the Persians? No. The Babylonians? No. The Assyrians? No. The Romans? No. Right? And then you talk about Great Britain and the British Empire. Is it still ruling the world? No. So for most of our lives, the superpowers were us and the Soviet Union. Is the Soviet Union still a superpower? Not so much. And I wonder if we are not fading as a superpower. It's bound to happen sooner or later. But if you look at all of the tension that we have in our politics, I wonder if it's not because the world doesn't listen to us the way it used to. The number of people strictly alone in India and China means that their economics are going to be driving the world ship here pretty shortly. We may have the best army, but we're not going to have the most people that consume the most things. And when you take all that into effect, it may seem like we're just fighting amongst ourselves about answers, but maybe we haven't wondered what the question is. And the question just might be, are we fading as the empire? And when you're fading as the empire and you're losing your power, what do you want? You want to keep it, right? You want to go back to the way things were when we were the voice that everyone listened to, when we were the ones that showed up and called all the shots. But that doesn't happen anymore. And I think part of our political tension and the struggle that we have is that we don't know how to live not being the superpower just yet. And so we're living in this space where stones are starting to come down, and there's wars and rumors of wars, and it's not a comfortable place to live. But it's not just true of our nation, right, and of our democracy, our superpower status. It's true of the church. Some of you probably grew up in churches that were just growing and growing and kept having to build onto the building and always moving up an upward direction. And now we are lamenting that young people don't go to church. And some of you lament that your own kids don't go to church. And when we gather as the church, it doesn't function the way it did even when I was a kid. And sometimes that can be uncomfortable. And where do we want to go? Back. We want to go back to what we knew worked. And I've had the conversation with somebody who said, if we just taught Sunday school like we did in 1980, it would work. If we just did it right the way we used to do it, like dust off all the old stuff, get it out and do it again. But the culture has changed. And technology has changed. And the community has changed around us. And even that wants us sometimes to go back because it can seem like it's too much. So in these words of Jesus, we hear about stones falling and nations against kingdoms. And at the same time, we feel all of that kind of happening around us, and we don't like it. And so we fight to go back to where we were, or, as Jesus warns, many will come in my name, right? People convince us that the way forward is progress, or build this new thing, or just do these other activities, or get involved in this organization, and it'll make things better. But at the same time, it's all just kind of in that place of stir. So what do we do with all of that? Well, Jesus came into this world and joined us in our journey. And they built something for Jesus. What did they build for Jesus? A cross. They built a cross for Jesus, and on that cross, he was destroyed, if you will. He was torn down. And so all of this destroying and all of the things that we tear down just meets Jesus right there at the cross. Whether it's a community that we would tear apart, or a marriage, or a relationship with our children, all of that stuff just lands in that place of the cross. And then out the other side comes resurrection life, right? So God makes something new. Now, we read the gospel for the week to come in our staff meeting every week. And on Monday, 3 people in that conversation were women, 2 of whom have had brought children into this world, right? So as we read this story, I'm hearing all the bad stuff, and one of them points out that it ends with Jesus saying, these are the birth pangs. Now, are birth pangs painful? Yes. Roger, I don't think you could say yes. But for those of you that have experienced them, they are painful, correct? And what happens after the birth pangs? Joy. That's the same thing they said in the first service. Joy. So the birth pangs lead to joy, right? They lead to baby and new life. And so as Jesus is talking about all of this scary stuff, all of this is going to come down, and the disciples are probably just thinking, and they ask, like, when's this going to happen? They're getting amped up. Jesus says, don't be afraid. Be not alarmed. These are birth pangs, and following birth pang comes joy. So what Jesus is telling them is that God is always up to making something new. Sometimes we like to attribute suffering to God and bad things to God because it makes us comfortable that our suffering has meaning. And so we say, well, God must have had to do that, right? So that something good could happen. But I think it's the other way around. We create all the bad stuff, and God keeps coming into that to make new things happen. Coming into those places of suffering and destruction, and in those places, then make something new. Now, Jesus is standing amidst them when they can't see the new, and is saying, new stuff is coming. He may well be talking about his own death, because he talks about himself as a temple that gets torn down and raised in 3 days. But he's also talking about the world around him and saying, look, new life is going to be the thing. God is going to come again and again and again to make things new, even if you can't see that when the stones are coming down. I thought this week about my home church. It was built in 1966. We showed up 1979 to a pretty healthy congregation, as I recall, as much as I can from being 5 or whatever I was. But by the time I was in high school, the congregation had shrunk down to about 30 people. We could barely get worship pulled off some weeks when a lot of people were gone. And the airport was very close by. Sometimes the pastor had to stop preaching when the jets were taking off because you couldn't hear anything. And it came up that the airport was going to have to buy out this whole neighborhood for noise abatement. So the congregation was trying to figure out, well, what do we do? How do we live through this? We have no permanent pastor right now. And so they sold a part of the land to the airport early and called the pastor and told him, we can pay you for 2 years. That's all. We don't know what happens after that. So he comes into this place where this text would sound pretty familiar, right? Stone's going to fall from the stones. The airport's going to take the building. What are we going to do as a church? And from what I understand, what my parents shared with me is that was a time where the remnant kind of stood together and said, maybe this has run its course. Maybe it's time for us to just sell the thing to the airport, give the money to the church synod, and then just go disperse and kind of go our own way. But amidst all of that, they saw glimmers of something new, right? Amidst the struggle and the pain and the hard decisions, those were birth pangs to a thing that God was making happen. And so they ended up moving to a new road in a new part of the same community and built a new building. And that happened about the time that I was off in college, and this new building, now new people saw it because they drove by, and pretty soon the 30 people were 90 people and 100 people. And it was a whole different kind of renewal of this place. And so something new happened out of all that struggle. Then guess what happened? The airport again. This time they decided they needed a new runway. And where was the new runway going to go? Right next to the church. And so actually the mission, every annual meeting for a good number of years, the congregation had a standing resolution that we would stand with the people who were being displaced. Stand with the people whose homes were going to get destroyed, right? And so the church became the voice of pointing to that new thing that God was up to, even amidst people losing homes they had raised their families in and lived in all of their lives, right? And now here's the church standing with them. But then the airport now has to buy the church again. Now I have to tell you, these are important places to me. I got confirmed in the first one. In the second one, we had my dad's funeral. Both my children were baptized. Our wedding was going to be too big for the little church, so it was also a little church with a big heart, still is. So we went around the church according to the Presbyterian church. Well, then the runway came, and that building, the one we got married in, was under the runway. The one that I grew up in, I think, is like an airport office next to the runway. But then a third location now, right? So amidst all of that pain, the pain of whole neighborhoods being displaced, many people in the congregation had to move because of it. The whole congregation now having to leave this building that had been part of its life and go to now a third new place. And yet, there was a new place. And in that new place, there was also some discovery about who the congregation always had been. When they built the original building, there was a young kid in the congregation that had some special needs. And so they built a school behind it. And for a long time, it was a special needs preschool. And that kind of ran its course, and I didn't even know that that was a thing until they got into the third building, and a kid in the congregation had special needs, and the people started to talk, and they said, you know what, that's who we were. And that's who we still can be. And now in this new place, there's new life and all kinds of new things happening. But all of it came out of the pain, right, of having to lose a place and move again and see, right, the stones coming down and the rumors and the pains and the struggles. So as we live in a time where this text sounds like it's right here with us, earthquakes, yes, and fires with tons of people missing, and floods and storms, and the church is sometimes struggling, and our country is struggling. This text, we ought to just get to that bottom part where Jesus says, these are birth pangs, because the God that raised Jesus from the dead is the same God that always shows up to drag us to new things. And those new things may be new places, they may be new relationships, they may be new opportunities with our health and with our lives. And every time we go to those places and we point out those stories, we are the witnesses of that resurrection. And those stories then go out into the world and touch people's lives so that they too can know that the struggle that they are living with right now is not the end, and that the new thing that they can't yet see is coming, because God never gives up on us and keeps bringing that newness to us each and every day. Amen.